Welcome to Biblio Cultist, where I review books that I find interesting in the realms of fiction, history, and religion or philosophy, depending on how you look at it. In this episode, I will go through two books. I usually do one book, but in this case, it makes sense to do these two books together. So, the Satanic Bible by Anton LaVey and the Satanic Bible 50th Anniversary Revision by Michael Aquino. So I think these two books complement each other, and they're obviously related to each other, so I think it's a good idea to put them together. First, please remember to subscribe to the channel, like the video, share the video, and click the bell notification if you want to be alerted when I come up with a new video. Every Sunday, a new video actually comes out. Comment on the video if you have any questions or if you just want to give some feedback. Before I go into the content, first let me go into the basics of the printing. So the Satanic Bible, a book that I've had for many years, and I bought it when I was a kid, basically, which is Anton LaVey's Satanic Bible, is by Avon Books, and the printing is 1969. Now, this book, I think, is actually an original from 1969, but I could be wrong. I don't have another one to compare. I don't know if the more modern editions say the same dates, so I'm not sure about it, but I'm pretty sure this is an original. Could be, I could be wrong. Great edition. It's a really old, but it has a beauty to it by being old. I did love this book a lot when I was younger. The second book is what appears to be a self-publish, and it was self-published in 2018. So what I'll do is I'll go through each of these books separately. I'll start with Anton LaVey's Satanic Bible, which is the original, and then I'll go to the other. Again, I try to do these reviews as spoiler-free as I can. And in the case of these books, which I love, the point of this is primarily to give you a general conception of the book and give you a comparison of the books. I think you should have both of them because they're very good in their own right and they're very good together. So I'll start with LaVey. The Satanic Bible is divided into 4 books. The Book of Satan, the Book of Lucifer, the Book of Belial, and the Book of Leviathan. Now, you have to understand a little bit of the context of the publishing of these books, because I know I'm going to have Christians and other people watching. So the book's premise is primarily one of marketing. And what I mean by this, if you look at the history of the book, it started more as Anton LaVey's way of promoting his ideas. Anton LaVey did not have a book at the time, but he would give classes on magic and on metaphysics and religion in general. He was an interesting, kind of curious character in San Francisco at the time in the 60s. So he was approached to publish a book saying, look, if you publish a book about Satanism, it would sell. And he decided to put it together, and this is what came out. That doesn't subtract from the value of the book at all. I think it gives it some interesting dynamic to it, actually. When it comes to the beauty of books and the history of books and how books come together, any story of, anything interesting about how a book comes together to me is valuable. So what Anton LaVey did is he decided to divide the book into these 4 chapters, basically, and give a characteristic to each of those chapters. So, for example, the Book of Satan, which became a controversial in its own right because it's a very aggressive part of the book, a very anti-Christian part of the book, and that's why it's called the Book of Satan, because it's very aggressive, kind of angry kind of chapter. But it's actually not a work by Anton LaVey. The Book of Satan is really depending on how you want to say it. Some people would say a plagiarism. Some would say a recognition or a commemoration of Midas Right by Ragnar Redbeard. So it's not exactly Midas Right is a book of its own length, its own work. It's a very interesting, very entertaining read, actually. But what Anton LaVey did is that he cut up sections of the book and put together the sections that he thought that were the more interesting and relevant for his work. He doesn't mention Midas Right in his work. So therefore, that's where the plagiarism aspect comes in, because some people say if he didn't credit Midas Right, then he is plagiarizing Midas Right. It's a difficult point because I understand and appreciate what Anton LaVey did in that book. He's taking pieces of Midas Right and putting it together and giving the words to Satan. So it's not like LaVey himself is saying, I wrote this. But when I read it as a kid, I thought he wrote it. So that gives you an idea of the perception. Although it was clear to me as a young person that he was trying to say that Satan said it, right? So when I read it, okay, Satan is saying this. But at the same time, you understood it was the author saying it. And then later on, I found out it was neither Satan or LaVey. It was actually Ragnar Redbeard, whom a lot of academics still don't know who he was. So it is an anonymous work. And for that reason, it's difficult to call it plagiarism in the sense of an author who we don't even know who he is, but he did have an attributed name, Ragnar Redbeard. So in theory, you could say that Anton LaVey could have said Ragnar Redbeard or give him some recognition. And he does mention Ragnar Redbeard in the book. It's just not in the context of the Book of Satan. So just keeping that in mind. But actually, he does a great work in kind of doing I would say, a small collection of aphorisms that you find in the Book of Satan. They come from Midas Right. Then you have the Book of Lucifer, and the Book of Lucifer is basically a couple of small essays by Anton LaVey on the topics of religion, philosophy, psychology, all these kinds of subjects. They're all very interesting, very entertaining reading. I'll mention my 4 favorite ones. So, 5th section of the Book of Lucifer, which is the one on love and hate. I always enjoy that section just because it deals honestly with emotions. In Christianity, you do have a lot of this, love your enemies, and if someone steals your coat, give them your shirt, and that kind of thing. And I'm sorry if I'm butchering. I'm just giving a general feel of the perception as a young person of the Bible. And then when I read this, it impacted me because I agreed. I was like, yeah, hate has its place. That's why it exists. And love exists and has a place for that reason. So the whole love and hate dynamic and the very straightforward, honest aspect of that was very impactful for me as a kid and has always stayed with me. The 7th is also very interesting because it talks about psychic vampires. And I'm pretty sure this conception existed before LaVey, obviously. But the way that LaVey wrote about psychic vampires was also very impactful because it made me start analyzing human relationships from that purview. Is this person actually engaging with me because he likes me, or is this person being transparent with me, or is he just a psychic vampire? Is he just there to consume my energy, to utilize or exploit me in some way? And it's a very particular way of looking at human dynamics, and it has always stayed with me, so it's a great section. Then you have the 8th section, which is the one about indulgence and not compulsion. Also very impactful because there's an inclination in the kind of left-hand path Satanist world to go extreme on the issue of hedonism, if you will. I do what I want. No one can tell me what I can't do or cannot do. The whole point of life is to enjoy and to find pleasure, and this kind of very raw, kind of bestial aspect of the human animal, as LaVey would say. But LaVey here puts a nuance on that and makes a distinction between indulgence and compulsion. And that distinction has always been very smart for me because, again, there's quite a difference between being compulsively inclined towards hedonism and just indulging in what you want. Now, you could have criticisms of indulgence as well, philosophical, sociological critiques, no problem. But it is an important distinction to make, and he made them, and that was always very important. And then you have the 10th, the most controversial and the most interesting. It's controversial because of the path that the Church of Satan has taken when it comes to this issue and the controversies involved in it. And it's the one about life after death, because the dynamic of whether or not Anton LaVey believed in a situation or scenario in which you would survive your physical death is a controversy. Reading this chapter, and I remember reading it as a youth, I did not think Anton LaVey, here's Anton LaVey, he's an atheist. Maybe the first chapter makes you feel that way, God, wanted, dead or alive. That does have a feel that inclines one towards atheism. But the last chapter gives a different conception, and is the possibility of life after death through the survival of the ego, which is itself a form of metaphysics. And I think this is, in my opinion, undeniable, that Anton LaVey is positing a notion here that is not atheistic, at least not in the traditional sense of the term. And I'm going to read that a particular paragraph of that chapter because I think it would be relevant. So here's Anton LaVey on the topic. Quote, "If a person has been vital throughout his life and has fought to the end for his earthly existence, it is this ego which will refuse to die, even after the expiration of the flesh which housed it. Young children are to be admired for their driving enthusiasm for life. This is exemplified by the small child who refuses to go to bed when there is something exciting going on, and when once put to bed will sneak down the stairs to peek through the curtains and watch. It is this childlike vitality that will allow the Satanist to peek through the curtain of darkness and death and remain earthbound." So, as you can see, LaVey is clearly positing this notion of survival beyond the gates of death. So I think that is important because it will feed a little bit into the next book that I'm going to review here. And so I'll go into that when I get there. The third section of the Satanic Bible is the book of Belial, which is basically a section of rituals. And that's where you have the rituals that are about compassion, about, destruction rituals, etc. So he divides them into 4 basic ones. And he gives you the implements and all the dynamics. And this is where Anton LaVey does say that, magic is more of a psychological experience and not necessarily a metaphysical experience. So again, I'm not saying that LaVey doesn't hold positions that are coherent with a lot of aspects of atheism. I would say, to be very transparent here, I find it annoying to hear LaVey and Satanists call themselves atheists, because I think that they should just call themselves Satanists. That's their position. And that allows them flexibility to have ideas and notions that are not atheistic. Atheism is its own category, and in my opinion, a not very good category. They're making an absolute affirmation about something that they claim is impossible to know. If it is impossible to know whether God exists, then saying he does not exist is an affirmation. It's an absolute, actually. coming from a position that is theoretically a subjectivist position. So they're making an absolute declaration about something that they believe is impossible. So if you critique a Christian for saying the existence of God is an absolute fact, then you criticize them by saying you're crazy, how can you say such a thing? It's an absolute fact that he does not exist. That puts the position in very shaky ground. Whereas if you just declare yourself a Satanist, then you're basically within those bounds, and actually gives you a little bit more of a range. But that's just my personal opinion there. And then lastly, the book would be the Book of Leviathan. And the Book of Leviathan is basically what contains the Enochian keys. Now, the Enochian keys are also not LaVey's, and they have to do with high magic of the Middle Ages or late Middle Ages. And the Enochian keys are obviously related to John Dee. So I'll go a little bit into that when we go into Michael Aquino's book. So the Book of Satan was revolutionary at its time. It's a very simple, easy work. Most people can read it in 1 or 2 sittings, and it will give you an accurate perception of at least what you would call neo-Satanism, or the Satanism of the 60s and post-60s, which is not the Hollywood Satanism or the kind of, sacrificing babies kind of thing that people think, the fictitious kind of false narrative of what Satanism is all about. But we'll give you a notion of the Satanism of LaVey at least, because there's a lot of different ways of looking at this, and there's a lot of branches. But just staying to the LaVeyan conception, you cannot get an actual idea of what it is about and whether you agree or disagree unless you read it. If you read it and don't like it and disagree with it, no problem. There's a lot of things I disagree with there now that I'm older. But when I was younger, it was very impactful for me as a book. It also led me to read things about mythology that I never even considered before. So that has a lot of value to me, historically speaking. Now, Michael Aquino's Satanic Bible is basically a commemoration on the part of Michael Aquino to LaVey. The first impression I got from the book after I finished reading the book, but as I went through it, was that Michael Aquino still loved Anton LaVey very much and appreciated everything he did. At least that's my impression. And these two men separated during a controversy in the Church of Satan in regards to the selling of degrees. In the case of Anton LaVey, he believed that the degrees that you engage when you join the Church of Satan or you join any occultic organization, occultic, in quotes, you would have access to a degree system that goes all the way back to even Rosicrucians and Masonry and the Golden Dawn, etc., in which you enter, and as you go through mysteries, and this comes from a emulation of the mystery schools, you would go through these levels, these tiers, and as you go up in degrees, and the degrees would have names, etc. So Anton LaVey believed that these things were not very meaningful. He came to the conclusion that at the end of the day, if you wanted to really understand the advancement of a Satanist, it would be more through the real life engagement of a Satanist in the world, how successful they were in their particular areas, their accolades, etc. So that your degrees could be understood by financial success, social success, etc. And because this would indicate how successful a Satanist was, then the degrees could be or should be related to this. In the case of Michael Aquino's position is that he believed that these degrees were sacred, they were serious things, and that they should reflect an advancement of magical ability and not really what you would call mundane success. And hopefully I am not oversimplifying the conflict in a way that is offensive to anyone, but I'm doing my best here to kind of simplify this, because if not, the video will be too long. So Aquino says no, degrees should be different, and he goes on to found the Temple of Set, which still exists to this day, and their degree system is a more traditional, I would say, degree system. And I would say Church of Satan still keeps LaVey's conception of the degree system. So this gives you an idea of their dispute. Nonetheless, the Satanic Bible 50th Anniversary Edition by Michael Aquino is a way, I think it's the last book he ever published before he passed away, is basically a commemoration, a love letter to the work of Anton LaVey. And I would argue it is a confirmation that he had a belief that you could follow and should follow, in some cases, the system of Anton LaVey, but with his modifications or his elaboration. So this book is an elaboration of the Satanic Bible from the perspective of Michael Aquino. So if you want to be a Satanist, he's saying, then you should take into consideration these other dynamics that I think would benefit the LaVeyan Satanists if they went that way. So that's kind of the way I see the work that Michael Aquino is trying to do. So the book, he divides it in the same way, same structure: Book of Satan, Book of Lucifer, Book of Belial, Book of Leviathan. So same structure. In the Book of Satan, though, he takes out the Midas Right component and he inserts his own book, which is the Diabolicon, which is really an absolutely excellent book. Michael Aquino claims that he received this in some sort of inspiration or divine inspiration by the Lord of Darkness, by the devil, by Satan, and he wrote this while he was in the military. And he tells a story he has a great book called The History of the Church of Satan. And in that book, he tells the story of when he joined the Church of Satan and when this book came to him. And he wrote it in one sitting, and it's called the Diabolicon, and it's an absolutely excellent read. And so it is a good addition to the book. He shares some letters in which Anton LaVey was very impressed by the book. He shared it with the Church of Satan through the Cloven Hoof. So the claim by Aquino is that he was going to introduce this eventually into the Satanic Bible. Nonetheless, whether that's true or not is irrelevant. The point is, he takes out Midas Right, he puts the Diabolicon, and I think it is a very good addition in there. In the Book of Lucifer, he reworks the same essays of LaVey's Book of Lucifer. He doesn't put the same essay. He is assuming that you've read the essay, and he's just basically adding commentary to it. So he's simplifying those essays. You could read them by themselves, but I think if you read them as part of a commentary on the original, it will give you a more interesting experience. So same concepts of love and hate, psychic vampires, indulgence, not compulsion. But when it comes to life after death, which is the controversial aspect here, I'm going to also read a quote from Michael Aquino's version of the Satanic Bible, so you can have a notion how they relate to each other in this controversy, because this is another issue. Michael Aquino is considered to be a theistic Satanist, whereas LaVeyans call themselves atheistic Satanists. So this gives you here that controversy again kind of pops up in this work. But like I said, I believe that LaVey, at least in that essay, is pretty clear that he also believes in a similar concept, although not a very developed concept is still there. So here's what Michael Aquino says in that same section of the Book of Lucifer. Quote, "As the mind increased in power and self-awareness, it became less a prisoner in its physical shell and nature-governed mode of existence. Could it be that this process might continue to a stage at which the ego could break free altogether and become entirely self-contained? The entire thrust of Satanism seemed to lead in this direction. At the time of the Satanic Bible's writing, Anton was not prepared to be more definitive, but it was subsequently one of the principal areas of our mutual interest and investigation. So, again, he's not elaborating a lot there. He's just pointing out that this was definitely the conception in LaVey's mind about the survival of the ego beyond the physical death. Now, Aquino goes further and expands on the Book of Lucifer by adding a lot of chapters that really go deep into philosophy, metaphysics, and into even the ontological nature of the Satanist. And some epistemology, actually. So he's covering a lot of bases in that expansion. And I would say this is where he shines brightly in this book, because that's where you actually get a very sophisticated conception of what Satanism, especially LaVeyan Satanism, could be, based on a very educated analysis. And we have to remember that Michael Aquino was a very educated man, a very intelligent man, irrespective of whether people like him or not, because, he did psychological operations in the army, and there's a lot of accusations leveled against him. A lot of them have been proven false, but the point is, that is out there. So he is kind of used sometimes as a boogeyman of some sort. Irrespective of that, no one can deny the fact that he was a highly valued intellectual, and that can be seen in that section. He goes deeply into philosophical points and makes comparisons between LaVeyan Satanism and traditional philosophy, Platonism, Aristotelianism, etc. So that, to me, is the favorite part of the book and the most valuable part of the book, especially when he discusses the distinction between hedonism and Epicureanism, because he's making the case that a lot of Satanists become hedonistic, but in the case of Satanism, the way he sees it should be Epicurean. And lastly, in that section of the Book of Lucifer, you have my favorite aspect of this, and the most creative in my opinion, was the whole Egyptian mind star concept, because he takes the notions that are in the Book of the Dead, or the pyramid texts, and he goes into the way that the Egyptians divided the soul, or the personhood. Most people think of a person as a unified aspect or a unified entity. That's where the ontology aspect comes in. So the self is then divided into sections, but usually we're not talking about a lot of them. Most modern people think, well, I have my mind, and then my body, and then maybe someone would add a soul. But the Egyptians divided that into many sections, and what he does is he uses the concept of the divisions of the self into their own categories, right? So the body emanation, name emanation, shadow, heart, core, transmigration emanation, the neater, and the star. And these are the Egyptian concepts, but they're kind of reworked, and they're kind of presented in a way to be utilized in the context of Satanism as a methodology of enlightenment. And just to clarify, Michael Aquino did believe that there is a consciousness, a living being that he calls Set, but it's really Satan, because he calls him Satan before as well. That is an actual living being. That would be God, if you will, although it's different because he's not a creator ex nihilo. He's not a domineering being per se, but he's more the first self-aware consciousness from which all self-aware consciousness comes. So it has a similitude to the Eastern conceptions of this. So no doubt there's an inspiration there, but he is deeply rooted in the Egyptian ideas. So the introduction of the Egyptian mind star into the entire work is a very powerful way of doing that. And then finally, you have the Book of Belial with rituals. Obviously, Michael Aquino is very enamored with rituals. And of course, that section is very complicated and complex and very interesting. And then the final book would be the Book of Leviathan, which again, if you remember, in the LaVeyan Satanic Bible, he had the Enochian keys. Now here, what Michael Aquino does, he takes the Enochian keys, he reforms and fixes them, because there were a lot of errors in the original, something I think Anton LaVey was aware of. So what he does is he improves on the Enochian keys. He tries to be as accurate as possible. He removes a lot of stuff that shouldn't have been there. And then he adds another work of his called the Words of Set, which are basically the beginning of the Temple of Set. So the Temple of Set was inspired to start through the Words of Set, which is very similar conception to the Diabolicon, but its own category, its own way, introducing the character of Set. So what he does, he closes the book with the Words of Set. And I think it fits nicely actually in there. Together, it becomes kind of an integration of the Aquino-Setian concept kind of being integrated into the LaVeyan Satanic concept. So anyway, hopefully you found the review interesting. Again, these two books do complement each other greatly, even though in theory they're supposed to be two sides of a coin, I guess, or two opposing viewpoints in the realm of Satanism. But I think they fit nicely, and I think Aquino's book does do a good job in expanding and elaborating on LaVey's Satanic Bible. So find those books wherever you can find them, no matter the edition. Read it, enjoy the book, and please remember again to subscribe, like the video, share the video, click the bell for notifications, and I'll be more than happy to answer any questions you have in the comments. So thank you for joining me. See you next time.